Thank you so much. So now we're going to move into the panel, and we actually have some prepared questions, but there'll certainly be time after for any questions from the audience. Okay, so I'll start us off. So we actually, the speakers gave us some questions, and then I had a couple questions. And then, so for the speakers, I'll ask the question from who presented it, but obviously if you have some feedback or input that you wanted to add, please feel free to do so. So let's start with Kelly. Can you talk about any of the research you've seen on who is perceived to be responsible for developing the workforce?
So I alluded to this a bit in the presentation, but I think one of the problems we have with actually operationalizing these formal skill development programs and actually seeing organizations take this and run with it is the data that I'm seeing at a global level. In my previous role, we looked at about 15,000 workers across the US and split it up by geography and region and level. And it was very alarming, the disconnect that we saw from a leadership level, organizational leaders versus staff level employees. Staff level employees very much were pointing to organizations to take the responsibility and lead and provide the direction on where they should develop next, whereas organizational leaders very much were pointing back to individual workers and saying it's really up to you to be self-directed and figure this out. And then depending on country, there was a lot actually pointing back to the government and saying they need to intervene in light of the changing social contract between employees and organizations. And so I think responsibility and who's responsible for the workforce development is ultimately important. But I love what Kevin said at the end. I mean, I think no matter what, in my mind, organizations should enable and provide the environments and tools and resources, but it's ultimately up to the individual motivation of the employee to take lead as well.
Thank you. Anyone want to add to that? We're good? Okay. I'm just going to move on. So, Ed, what are some examples of jobs that may be eliminated, and will there be new jobs to replace them?
As we discussed in the speeches, the types of jobs that are for sure going to be, they're going to change. Let's not necessarily they're going to be eliminated. Any job that's got some sort of routine, administrative type tasking associated. The automation that is coming. Or really that's here today, are machines that can do just very, very specialized, specific tasks. So within recruiting, I think I talked earlier about the recruiting coordination. So all of the scheduling, for example, clearly is a type of role that will be short-lived. I mean, I think one of the things that we're seeing is in the scheduling arena in particular, there's a lot of different complexities to it. So, but about 60 to 70% today can be replaced 100% through automation. So you're talking about like one-on-one type scheduling. It gets more complex when you have multiple panels, things of that nature, and other types of logistics. So the roles will change where the automation will take over, and for those specific types of tasks, and the humans will do what the humans do best, the things that are complex, that require critical thinking. And so it's going to be something that will certainly take some time, but we're seeing differences. Just think about just walking through the airport, Philadelphia airport today. I don't think you can, in some parts of that airport, actually interact with a human to buy something, right? I mean, it's all self-service checkout. So those types of positions, right? We're going to see, lots of jobs where people were previously employed to handle those types of checkouts. Now there will still be some jobs, people will be there to assist, but those types of roles are definitely going to be reducing significantly.
Thanks, Ed. And I just wanted to add, so being in HR, I think most of us can say that we have too much on our plate anyway. So I had a problem with everything that my team was doing was very, very manual. And so there was never a fear for me that if we made things automated that they wouldn't have jobs, because they had so much on their plate anyway that it just made their job a little bit easier. So, does anyone else want to add to that? Okay, so I just wanted to throw in a question, and maybe I'll start with Kevin. I saw, so as an HR person, when I was at my prior company, we used DISC. And then since I moved to a new position, I'm doing HR consulting. So we're trying to figure out a good test, and I meet these tons of wonderful people, predictive indexing, Clifton strength test. You mentioned Myers-Briggs and Clifton. And I'm just wondering if you have some thoughts, and actually anyone, on what are some of the better tests that you might recommend for people.
I certainly have some thoughts. I have no qualifications in these areas. Let me just say that at first. So the gold standard that test that psychologists actually use, the 5-factor model called the Big Five. And nobody in business uses it because it's so complex. What is very popular, the most popular tool is DISC, which also happens to be one of the simplest tools. And then Myers-Briggs, MBTI, is slightly more complicated, 16 boxes. So that's a little less popular, but still popular. And here's the thing. The purists, including Professor Adam Grant up the road from here, takes a lot of shots right now at how, they call them horoscopes, DISC, Myers-Briggs, et cetera, et cetera. And what their big problem is the level of simplification. So for example, most of us think about a DISC or something as, say, introvert or extrovert. Well, your actual result is like, say, compared to the rest of the population. So if you're a 51 and I'm a 49, you could be an extrovert, I could be an introvert, but we're only 2 tiny points away from each other. Now, in the real forms, these assessments give you these scores and can be quite accurate. But the only way we remember them is when they're simplified. So I look at it as any instrument that helps us to do some self-awareness and to just realize I'm different than you and I can modulate my communication and my style to you or vice versa, it's a good instrument. Coach Amanda uses the 5-factor model, the gold standard, but I think any instrument is a good instrument to get started with. Probably other people that have experience on that.
Thank you. Anyone? I threw that curveball, so thank you. Wayne, you want to?
Yeah. This is for Natasha. What do you think the most transformative technology from a human capital perspective will be?
So what is it and what will it be? So let me just say, what is it? It's the smartphone, right? So now we can use our smartphone to check emails, log things, bank. We can do so many things while we're on the run and hopefully getting out there and being productive in our work. So I think that's just made us extremely productive. From a future perspective, I think that artificial intelligence and the buildup of artificial intelligence is just going to keep on helping human capital be more agile and smarter and help their leadership coach them to become more agile and smarter in any of their opportunities or weak points.
I had a question for Kevin. In terms of people's comfort level with, using bots as a coach, obviously there's a certain concerns about that, I guess. What's been your reaction to that?
Among the managers and stuff who've used it, they've not expressed a concern about it. Where we get the concern, and I think rightly so, are from the human executive coaches. Maybe thinking about the future, but the purists, the most trained, will say, listen, a human coach will never give you an answer. You're coaching someone to explore and to dig deep and to get some self-awareness, et cetera. And now there will be other coaches who really are more acting like consultants who do provide answers to your questions. And so we're trying to straddle the space. Like, we agree that the best coach will let you do the work. Having said that, we are, with this release, we offer up action plans that are ready to go. We suggest goals for you. We think in the future, though, the more that the robot coaches can act like the human coaches, the better.
Thanks. Okay, so next I want to ask, let's see, we'll go back to Kelly. What are some examples of organizations who are taking a lead in developing their workforce for the future?
So a couple good examples, and I'm sure there could be even some here in the room today, but one couple to watch is AT&T. So they have a workforce that has been traditionally trained in actually servicing telephone poles and more mechanical type workers. And now they're trying to transition to a cloud-based digital company. It's a very different skill set, but they're really trying to take an employee-centric approach first and take that same talent and allow them the space and creativity to learn and transition. So they have a mandatory skills up program so that their current workforce can stay employed. And now there's some, we can talk about the psychology when you start to make that mandatory, but I think it's a great opportunity that organizations have and are facilitating that environment, and they've transformed their offices and actually have created Lego rooms, and if they've learned these type of workers learn best with their hands. And so that's what they're doing, is facilitating those conditions. So again, using design thinking principles, putting the customer up front. I do have to give a shout out to Accenture. I've only been here 5 days, but it was funny. It was a little overwhelming actually at first. The day before I started, I got an email from them saying, "We know we hired you because you have these skills, but we anticipate you need to upskill within the next 2 years to stay relevant within our organization. Here's a personalized path we've created for you. It's up to you whether or not you want to take this journey, but we highly recommend you begin the upskill journey day one." And so again, that just puts that pressure and emphasis, and they use some nudge theory too, I've realized, even being here day 5, to make sure that I'm accelerating that journey. And so I think companies that are putting that, intentionally putting this upskilling at the forefront, it's up for me whether or not I make that journey myself, but it feels actually very comforting to know I have those resources.
Oh, sure. Are there any questions from the audience? Want to pepper in some? Anyone? Oh, go ahead.
Sure, my name is Rachel. We heard a lot about leadership development, which I think is awesome, because clearly we're in a space where we need to be thinking about this all the time. But we also know that I think it's between 10 and 20% of leadership development programs are effective, which means most of us are spending time in programs that aren't doing very well. So I didn't know about AI coaching, and I think that's a phenomenal development. But are there any other practices or ways of developing leadership within our companies that might be useful?
Anyone want to volunteer? Ed? Kelly? We'll put anyone on the spot.
I think a couple things. So that was actually one of my big projects at my former organization. It was, how can we take highly technical managers and make them actually people leaders, especially in back office functions that were being automated. And a couple things is, one is starting and actually teaching people the assumption most people in leadership presume people don't want to be there or actually don't want to work. And actually just starting with that basic assumption changes everything. So you lead very differently when you presume people actually want to be there, and you take on a different, so we do a lot of, and get to Kevin's point, self-awareness. What are my actual mental models around people at work? And so I spent 18 months trying to see if we could shift that mental model, because the majority of our managers came in 75 to 80% and said, no, I don't think people inherently want to work. That's why I have a job. And then ultimately really having, and especially in a learning environment, to use the word that Kevin used, is really how do we teach managers to think with a growth mindset and anticipate failure, and creating these safe spaces that Google found psychological safety is the #1 predictor of performance. So how do we teach our leaders to create these environments? And it all starts with your mindset. And so I think I see leadership development moving much deeper into our assumptions around people at work, and actually coaching and training people to treat each other with decent respect.
Thanks, Kelly. Actually, you have a question?
Yeah, sure. Patrick, so over the past, I'd say probably 3 years in my line of work, I've noticed an uprising of new roles in organizations. You know, there was always HR, but now you have people officers, and you have engagement directors and people of that nature. What jobs do you see kind of entering into the world that really aren't even around now, or at least titles? Maybe they're there, but not officially. what roles do you think will be opening up for organizations or for people within organizations as the EQ of the need for EQ is growing within companies for growth purposes?
Anyone want to take that?
So one of the trends that I've seen is the focus on experience. So we've had talent acquisition, we've had talent management, and now we're starting to see the term talent experience come out. And there's actually some companies who have hired VPs of talent experience. The question is, how does that fit into the organizational structure? Is it, because there's some overlap, right? It covers a little bit of talent acquisition, a little bit of talent management. I think that eventually the talent experience will ultimately be sort of over those other functions. So within a talent experience function, you'll have talent acquisition, talent management activities, but it's the focal point of the organization will be on managing the experience and delivering the experience. So doing things like persona definition, define the various personas, and do journey mapping, and then design an experience that you want to deliver to any given persona across the board. So I think talent experience is probably one of the things that I'm seeing. It's pretty near term. Titles are starting to show up pretty frequently now.
And just to clarify, when you say talent experience, obviously we have the employee experience already out there. When you say talent experience, are you looking at it from internal already employees as well as recruits that you're trying to bring into the organization?
So great follow-up. He asked whether I meant to include the internal employee experience as well as externals, and yes. So talent experience as a total comprehensive view. You think about the talent life cycle. It starts from whatever that first brand impression is, all the way through a recruiting process, onboarding. You're now an employee. You go through maybe a couple different roles. Maybe you exit and you're an alumni. Maybe you come back. So it's a very cyclical, complete circle, and absolutely includes the employee as well. I think it's an area where in HR we've taken our hands off the wheel. Internal mobility, we pretty much let the people kind of fend for themselves. And so to manage that experience and actually design and deliver that experience, and again, it might not take on all of the talent management functions, but any activity that an employee has related to their career progression and how their talents are being utilized by the company, I think is where there's going to be focal points. So yes, it absolutely includes a focus on internal.
Yeah. You do see employer branding starting to come back under HR now versus it used to be under marketing. So you see it under HR more commonly.
And what's happening is HR and the talent brand function, they're bringing in marketing people. They're actually hiring marketing talent into those functions.
Thank you.
Of course.
So I was actually going to say the same thing, experience managers. So it's really important, and so totally aligned with what you're saying. And the one thing, as a marketer who's been hired in to help companies come up with some of this, the experience and what it should look like from a digital perspective, is that experienced leaders really have to be very well engaged and aligned with the technology organizations. And oftentimes, I'm sure we find, and I find this in marketing as well, is that it's not always very well connected, right? And so when the technical experience doesn't, or the digital experience doesn't align with the talent or the employee experience that you're trying to create, it's always going to be a big disconnect, and it won't work. So I think that that's a really important component to this. I'm sure you probably were thinking that anyway, so yeah.
And actually, follow-up question for Natasha, but Kelly talked about psychological safety, and I think that trust has a lot to do with that. And I know we see today that a lot of people want to work from home and they want to have better balance, et cetera. So my question for Natasha is, understanding that there is a strong push for employees to work remotely or have a telepresence of some level, how can a company ensure that employees are actually working or getting their jobs done? And I know for myself as an HR professional, that's something that managers have brought to me all the time. So I would love to hear your feedback.
So I was called into one of my clients recently, not to stereotype, but it was a khaki pant wearing, golf shirt wearing company where they had a big coffee shop in the middle with a lot of sofas, and but it was, you know, all enclosed offices, the classic style. And they said, we really need to transform our human resource experience, and we need people to be happy when they come to work, so that they're more productive and that they can do their best, et cetera, et cetera. Help us figure this out. And then on top of it, so after a lot of discussion, I said, well, what's the end goal? The end goal for them was to be able to hire contracted resources on an as-needed basis, but maximize the internal people that they had and the talent that they had in different roles, being able to shift from one thing to the next if they needed to, and just to be agile to help the company whenever things came up or when projects came up. So it's a consulting company. So obviously, like, a lot of projects would come up that are very different and unique from one to the next, et cetera. And the first thing I said was, if you, their goal was that their employees they wanted to create a facade or whatever, an environment where the employees were happy to come to work. So foosball tables, kegs, whatever, right? The first thing I asked is, these are people who are generally working globally, working for clients that are in Minnesota and they're based out of Philadelphia. Why are they coming here? What's the point of them actually coming here? Sometimes it's necessary as employees for us to actually be on site, right? There's collaboration, there's innovation, ideation, all those things that happen. But then sometimes it's not. And I think that was I think their actually inflection point was to say, well, maybe we don't need people to actually physically be on site. You're right. We should create an environment where if they're here, they can collaborate, they can ideate, they can come up with new ideas and new things and solutions and network in the company. But we need to create technology and tools and assets for them to be able to work when it works for them. And that's when we're going to get our biggest or the most productivity out of people. So I believe that it's about trust. And if you're building an organization where you're expecting, and you have a very high, level or a bar that you've raised, and you're expecting a certain level out of your employees, you've got to trust them to do that work. And you have to, as a manager and as human resources, be diligent enough to follow through to make sure that you're guiding them and nurturing them in that process, because it is a big change to go from khaki pants and golf shirts and a coffee shop in the middle of the office to come if you want to, wear ripped up jeans, don't come if you don't want to, just get your work done. So that's my perspective.
I just want to add to that. So I ran a consulting business for about 15 years, and it was 100% virtual, never spent a nickel on office space. And I can tell you there's pros and cons to virtual work situations. Knowing that somebody's doing work is not one of them. That's not one of the issues, right? I mean, think about it. Tell that person, how do you know the person 2 floors down from you is doing their work? I mean, the work gets done. So knowing that they're working is not the problem.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something Natasha said about kind of agility in work. It's the gig economy. We have all kinds of people in the office nowadays. We have employees, we have contractors, we have vendors, and how do we all put it together? It's a challenge, especially when you're looking at on-demand talent. I guess Peter Capelli or someone else mentioned that phrase. Maybe, I don't think anybody has the answer, but what are organizations doing in that? Have you seen any kind of research or companies kind of getting a handle on it, or maybe making some progress with that?
So as a consulting firm, we use a lot of contract workers. So I think the first thing is where is that housed? And a lot of times it's housed in procurement, not even within talent organizations, and that's not necessarily the best employee experience. In second, I did some research with, I don't know, those of you might be familiar with John Hagel or John Seely Brown, and the question that we just asked in an MIT SMR article was, to what end are you using the contract workforce? Is it for cost optimization? And if that's it, that's not going to be a good experience. You're not going to get the quality, which is why I think we see a lot of quality issues in the research with using the contract workforce. And so how do we put that same sense of meaning and value, and how do you actually curate experiences for the contract worker that they actually feel part of something and part of a purpose, and not just necessarily, and I think the biggest purpose that we found in our research was contract workers or gig workers actually want to be employed longer term. They're seeking a lot of times stability, and they need either the experience or the skill set. So if you as an organization can help provide them either their next gig or their next opportunity, they very much see it as a development opportunity. But rarely is the gig economy or contract work experience curated in a way where development's at the forefront for them. So that's something that we're trying to shift over to.
Have you seen any contract employers that are actually doing that really well? Or is it?
Yeah, I was going to say, that's a really good question. Is there any companies that are using contract workers well or in that capacity? I'm trying to think through that actually real quick. There's a couple small companies that I have to go back and look at their names, but I haven't seen anyone, honestly, from a large scale. I mean, even as a consulting firms, we're still trying to get our head around moving it from procurement over to, and then there's also legal laws that hinder the actual ability for organizations to interact well with contract workers, even giving them a laptop or a cell phone and being left off of emails, and their whole team's going to a happy hour, but they're not within the database. So, you know, I haven't personally seen anything, but there has to be companies out there, and that's a great question.
I'm in the staffing industry, so, and large MSPs have come in the last 15 years to manage, sorry, I'm in staffing, Stephanie. So I completely resonate with that. I was actually talking with Ed about that before the presentation, that being in the staffing industry now for 14 years, there's been a huge dramatic shift to where, you know, 95% of large employers are using an MSP partner as a go-between, and I've sat at SIA, Staffing Industry Analyst Executive Forums, where they will stand up and say, we want the lowest cost, best, so they sort on cost first. And there's a lot of no-touch programs, so there's a lot of challenge for even the agency partners to understand what's best need. So when you commoditize your people, and then you expect quality and value, it's the standard pyramid. You know, you're not gonna get high quality if you have created an experience like that. So it's a big challenge. I think there are some shifts in some managed service providers that I've worked with as a partner that do it really well. They allow contact with hiring managers. They allow you to really understand the programs and initiatives that the clients are doing. But, you know, if you're setting it up through procurement and you're saying like, well, like, let's look at this 20% of contract workers as a truly expendable, then they're going to be that way. So.
So I actually work for an organization that focuses on the employee experience and employee engagement and culture. And one of the things that I have done with a lot of my clients who do have a lot of contracted workers is they always say to me, well, do we want to focus on them? And I say to them, well, do they work for you solely? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, then why wouldn't you want to understand the experience that they're having, because you're paying them to do a job, and wouldn't you want them to, to be engaged, to feel like they're a part of something? So I only have my own experiences to go off of, but once I speak that truth to them, they're like, oh yeah, that makes so much sense. So I think it's starting to turn where, as long as people kind of press that a little bit more, I think you'll start seeing more organizations focusing on the contracted workers as being, a part of the conglomerate, so to speak.
But to Kelly's point, we just have to be careful with that, because if they're too intertwined, as an employment lawyer, I'll tell, then you cross the line between employee and contractor. So.
And my question's about what you would recommend in terms of best practices in HR's selection and implementation of AI tools, because there is this pressure, and to some extent, a zombie march towards we need to use AI, and then things like Amazon happen where they have AI embedded in their recruiting process, and then, oh crap, it's discriminatory against women, we have to pull that out. My own organization, we use AI in the recruiting capacity, but at first it was like we were over depending on it. We had to pull out one tool we were using, and then implement another tool it's good to take at taking the ocean and narrowing it down to a lake, but then you still at this stage need a human to really go through the lake, so to speak. So I was just curious, like what framework do you recommend in terms of selecting and implementing?
So I was talking with a prospect not too long ago, and I actually heard these words uttered, we need to get on the AI this year. So I mean, AI is this capability that's going to be essentially embedded in almost everything, right? Almost every experience that you have will eventually have some sort of AI powering it. So I would encourage you to not think about how do I go pick and select AI. It's what are the problems I'm trying to solve, and let me go see what the latest tech is out there that can help me solve those problems. And guess what? You're going to find some AI because it's getting pumped into just about everything. And so certainly you can go look for it. One of the things that I've found when people start thinking about looking at AI, they equate it to a chatbot. If a chatbot's there, that means there's AI. But there's a whole lot of other aspects of AI to consider that have nothing to do with a chatbot, and sometimes a chatbot might not even be that smart. So I would just encourage you to focus on the problems. And even in terms of like measuring the value that you're getting from the investment, you don't want to get caught up in saying, what value did I get from that AI algorithm? It's did I solve the problem with the tech that I brought in that I was trying to solve for? So I would just focus more on that than too much specific focus on getting AI in the organization.
Michael Thomas. This question is specifically for Kelly, if you don't mind. So I'm in a situation now where you brought up a great point where self-directed versus organizationally directed. And I have some staff that want to be organizationally directed and some staff that want to be self-directed. So if you're starting from scratch, Kelly owns her own consulting firm, how would you start and pilot a new L&D program? Where would you land between? Would you individualize it? How would you handle that?
That's a great question. So, I think where I would start was what I was trying to allude to a little bit before is a lot of times we've got to get to the actual root cause of why people don't necessarily engage in leadership development. And a lot of times it is a mindset issue. Folks at Wharton actually are really good at studying that. And so what I would do is do two things. One, as an organization, you have to provide the resources and tools and environment. The culture is a big part of it. And so you have to facilitate those conditions. And then the other thing is, and I think actually what Kevin had in his AI, which was great, is using behavioral science and nudges to help make it easier for people to be self-directed. We make it often so hard for people to be self-directed in our organizations. It's so complicated, or the training videos are awful and it's boring, and we also don't have the time. So I do like a little bit what AT&T did in mandatory, making some space. Now that's up to the employee. They can go to Starbucks, they can go surf Facebook, that's up to them. But to actually facilitate those conditions as an organization, I think is key. And again, leveraging behavioral science nudges and providing those reminders. A program I did at Deloitte, this management program, we called it Mindset Mondays. And for 12 weeks, every Monday morning, a manager would come in and receive an email. And at first, being more of a purist and academic, I wanted to provide all the theory of why they should be engaging with their employees in more human ways. Finally, we got enough feedback and said, what, just tell me what to do. I really am lost here. I'm not an IO psychologist. I just need to know, how do I interact better with employees? And so we got it really short and sweet. And every Monday, they had an opportunity to engage in a learning activity and actually practice. The last thing I would do is set up peer accountability. We know as adult learners, accountability is key, and having social learning networks, we learn best from peers, less than top down. And so I'd focus on the mindsets. I'd establish peer learning communities, and I would leverage nudge theory and behavioral science to really reinforce those principles.
I know you didn't ask me, but sorry, Kevin. This is a great That was a great answer. I think environment, get the friction out. The only other thing I would add is start to hire for growth mindset. So make that part of your selection process, because I mean, it's insane to me that people don't all have a growth mindset. I mean, if you are not learning all the time, like, you're gonna be roadkill. So just hire the right people too.
Kevin, this might be a sort of follow-up, but I'll ask you and the whole panel can answer. You know, in terms of adoption of these new things, right? I venture to say that most people in this room, I would call them kind of the Lone Rangers, because they're here, they're into disruption, but they're fighting they're by themselves, they're fighting against the tide. They have managers who've been there a long time that probably don't want to change. They're waiting for retirement. And, you know, and how do we encourage them? You know, you have a very kind of unique application, the others, you know, technology. You know, what are some of the things you've seen worked well? And, you know, because I'm sure everybody here would like to do more in the organization, like to be more innovative, but the reality is it's tough to do sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's related to the previous question. I think that I'm only half joking when I feel like we should almost use it as a test, and all of you who show up for these kinds of things, great, you're the superstars, you get paid more money, and everybody who didn't show up, they're all fired tomorrow. You know, like, you've got to have a culture that rewards innovation and all of that, but environment's always going to be the #1 variable. So we think, you know, if you have a learning opportunity on your phone that's as easy to use as Snapchat or Instagram or anything else, that's a step in the right direction. You don't have to log in somewhere, remember 3 passwords, click 18 times, and then watch, you know, something pretty boring. So I think getting the friction out of the system, I think doing the reminders, we're just starting to think about the social elements, which are so critical. But this is where I become disheartened as we see the data. As easy as it is to serve people up, there's a lot of people out there that just don't want any part of it, and I don't know how you get through to them. It is frustrating.
Tasha, do you want to?
No, so I totally agree with you. I think that, you know, really thinking through and bringing in people, whether it's within your own team or somewhere else in the organization or even outside of the organization, that can help you through the change management process is really important. And it's not just, you know, the, you know, human resource experts that need to go through the change management, the recruiters, but, you know, if you're a global company, you have to think about, you know, the change management that it takes in those other offices as well across the globe, and what are some of their barriers as well in order to help them transition and kind of embrace this this new way of thinking, a transformative way of thinking with human capital.
Yeah, so change management is the answer. But what I've found over the years of all the technology projects that I've ever worked on, new tech, new process, high expectations, but they don't change the people. And so the classic issue is we want our recruiting function to behave more like a recruiting agency, right? We want to be finding people, not managing the incoming. So they try to automate as much as possible, and then say, we're gonna now you guys have to go out and find people. And what do? They go right back to what they used to do, and they manage the incoming because they either weren't reskilled, there was no attempt to reskill, but sometimes you have to change people. You have to get different types of people into roles to take advantage of what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I was going to open up some more questions.
Hi, this is Ash. A great panel, and you know, this is my first Hacking HR, and I feel that human capital is like the biggest asset, obviously. But what I have realized over my working years is when I work with my customers, there is not enough budgets, you know, which go into, as you said, into the adoption of the technology to really leverage, you know, as an investment plus bring in those efficiencies. So my request is, because I come from a technology background, and I feel it really hurts me when, you know, people have so many, people have aspirations and innovation, but it really doesn't reach the fruition because of budget. So as HR people, can you folks influence that in any way? Because I mean, ultimately it comes to budgets, right? Really, to hire adoption specialists or even invest in an AI tool. And I think we as a human species can do so much more. But I find it that it comes back to the budgets many times, and it hurts me, truly. So it's my, I'm just wondering if.
Yeah, do you have any ideas about how you convince your leadership that this stuff is really important? Does anyone want to take that?
I don't have a great answer. But what I needed budget for this whole pilot training that I was telling you about. And so just experiment and start really small. I mean, leaders need proof points. They need tangible evidence, especially when we start talking about growth mindset and soft skills and emotions. You know, leaders don't react well to a lot of those things, and it feels like you're taking time off productivity. But we are able to experiment, start small, learn fast, fail fast, pivot quickly, and adjust on the fly. And we were able to do so when we actually came in much under budget as a result of that. But when they were able to start seeing tangible evidence and use people analytics to help make your case.
Is there a question?
I'm just going to quickly add to that. My friend Pat could tell you a lot more about this, but from the vendor side, of course, we're asking the exact same question, which is how can we help HR make the business case and sell that in? So I would say rely on the vendors, talk to them and say, you help me sell this into the organization. Make use of them. Talk to Pat. He'll help me.
Oh, yeah, let me go back to you.
So this is a real quick question, but maybe it's long in answer. But you've talked a lot about hiring people and changes that can be made in the people of the organization. And it's brought up two questions for me. So everybody knows the engagement survey that's been released for the last 20 years, and the numbers have not changed. They remain 70% disengaged. One. Right? Okay, so whatever we're doing, however we're doing it, is not working. That's why we're all here, because we're trying to hack HR. So question would be like, what's the deal? What needs to happen in that respect for current engagement? And then when you think also about hiring these new employees, how is like true diversity and inclusion from the very top? How are we tapping into populations that we are ready to work, willing to work, but are being discriminated against, disabled, people that are 50 and older, or 40 and older, or 30 and older? If you're in the tech population, you're getting discriminated against if you're over 30, which makes you kind of want to feel ill if you're my age. Not if you're under 30 here. So those two questions are pretty divergent, but go for it.
Anyone? Where are we going?
So, two huge questions in there. I won't take the D&I question, but I asked the CEO of Gallup that first question about a week ago. I said, with everything that we've known and everything Gallup does and everything all the other agencies do, why isn't the needle moving on that? And I can't say exactly like his words, but he basically said that people, even if they're running the survey, they either, of course he's biased, so if they're running the Gallup survey, the quote-unquote right survey, okay, they still are stopping at the action plan. They're not realizing 70% of the variance in engagement is tied to who the manager is. Gallup's next big book is called It's the Manager. And so in my mind, employee engagement, employee experience should be owned by leadership development because 70% of it, it's the manager. So managers hopefully are getting their own scores, their engagement scores, and hopefully they're doing the little action planning in their groups. But then what happens to, we need more communication, we need more recognition. They remember it for a month, 6 weeks, not so much, 3 months, they're not doing anything with it. So I think, again, we need pull-through strategies and behavioral nudges and other things to pull that through. But I'll also use my time to say, back to the earlier question that was asked, how do we get people to change or care about this? So Doug Conant, former CEO of Campbell Soup, native of Philadelphia, one of the great CEO leaders around, when he went into Campbell Soup, he was told, you've got the worst employee engagement scores in the Fortune 500. 10 years later, they had the best employee engagement scores in the Fortune 500. Doug says, we measured it every year, did the normal stuff, but it was one of the 4 things managers were evaluated on for their bonus and their job. And he says, what most people don't know is my 3rd year as CEO, we fired 2/3 of the managers at Campbell Soup who were not getting it. You give them time, we're gonna measure it. This is how you do it. You're not doing so well. We're going to give you help. Okay, it's year 4. We're going to move you into another job. So I think it's got to start at the top. And so if we say leadership counts and the soft skill stuff counts and all that other stuff, but hey, sales manager, 100% of your bonus and promotion is, did you max out your quota? Well, they're going to focus on the task and not the people. But if their bonus and performance is tied to people as much as task, then I think it will balance out.
And I'll just add to that, because I totally agree. It's with the managers. And one of the things that I've seen companies starting to implement, like again, from a Salesforce perspective, is a net promoter score. If you're a sales rep, is using that net promoter score and rating the manager poorly or average, what does that mean? And then it's got to be taken up to the next level. So how do we now nurture that manager? To your point, I didn't have a 4-year plan, but it was a lot faster. In sales, it's a lot quicker, but you need to nurture that manager to be able to upskill themselves and to become better and more effective progressive leaders for their sales force. So, and that net promoter score is something that we've pushed out, or I've seen pushed out, across the globe in sales organizations, and it's where they can use that as often as they need to. So it's not just when they're on an annual basis or when their manager goes on a sales ride with them. It can be used as often as they feel they need to rate their manager. And it should be, also the one thing I would add to it is it's got to be, where it's a safe organization, right? The employees feel safe in order to be able to really provide their opinion and their perspective, even if it is a Gallup poll. A lot of times they think that they have to, they're going to be identified, right? I mean, how many employees think they're going to be identified, or if they rate certain things certain ways, or if there's any free form, like, oh my God, my manager is going to know. So we really have to encourage and force leadership to create an organization that feels safe and welcoming of all that feedback.
Does anybody want to talk diversity? So,
Yeah.
What was your question about diversity and inclusion? How do we?
Well, how do you use the future of HR or technology to really,
So somebody had mentioned earlier the Amazon story. I actually know more about that than what's been published, and they never really. It was not something that was actually put in practice. So Amazon does a lot of machine learning and AI type stuff. So they put a team together to put something like that in place. It never got put in place because of the results. So that's, I just want to kind of put that out there. It wasn't like that. And what happens is when you feed a machine biased data, you're going to get biased results. So one of the things that AI is actually doing is kind of putting a spotlight on it, right, and helping us figure out how do we make adjustments to improve this. I think that I came across an organization that's doing something pretty incredible for the tech side of the house. So women and underrepresented minorities in tech is a number that we haven't been able to crack for quite a while. Right? I've been talking about it a lot, been focused on it a lot, trying to get more women in tech, going from high school, getting into programs in college. And the problem is, they're not getting interested early enough, right? You can't, the numbers are going down because they're just not showing interest. So is it that they're not interested, or something didn't happen earlier on? So there's a organization, a nonprofit called code.org. Anybody familiar with that? So they basically recognize that you got to get them in middle school or earlier. So they've got all of this computer science curriculum that they're putting out there for school teachers to deliver at that level. They've got over 30 million students learning on this curriculum. 65% of them are girls and underrepresented minorities. It's an amazing thing. They're building this pipeline. And so it's not that they're not interested, they're just not getting interested early enough. So those are the type of things we got to do.
You good? Yeah, I'll just add one quick comment. Just from a research point, in terms of diversity and inclusion, when you think through your CEO, COO, and CFO, those tend to be the 3 strongest influencers of the business. If not one of those are some form of diversity, we found in our research it doesn't matter how much initiatives you have. they don't go through. So think about your CEO, COO, and CFO, and really pay attention at that level.
Thank you. I also want to put a plug in for Girls Who Code, too. Have you heard of that? Reshma Sujani. I saw her speak a few weeks ago, and she was amazing. So that's another great organization. I just wanted to go back to this gentleman because he had a question earlier.
You have to sit in the inner circle, I think. Yes, I'm Morris, first-time caller, long-time listener. I just wanted to ask, is any of this technology for companies outside of the Fortune 500 or less than 5,000 employees?
I'll give you my 2 cents. So I actually think that a lot of the smaller startup companies that I work with are embracing these types of technologies more because they have fewer people and they need to use and embrace technology and digital learning to do more with less. And if you get the right technologies, technology is not really all that expensive. Developing it, creating it, that's expensive. The guys who did the whole Watson thing, that's expensive, but organizations leveraging it, it's not really a whole lot more expensive than hiring 2 or 3 humans to do things instead. So I've seen it more prevalent and more active in the smaller organizations.
Yeah, I think if you look at the tech startups that support HR, I mean, when they're getting their initial funding, they don't have the ability to go create something that's enormously complex to handle large global national companies. They're building something that could probably be better utilized by a smaller business. So I think there's lots of opportunities out there for different tech. And they start out at that level, they're going to be pretty niche. So you'll be looking for products that are a pretty narrow scope in terms of what they can do. But there's lots of them out there. The funding in the industry is just incredible right now. There's so many startups.
Do you want to move on to another question?
Any other questions?
Okay. Oh, sorry.
Hi, Crystal. So I was wondering in general, what are the types of resources that you guys turn to personally for these updates and trends in HR that you're seeing?
Anyone?
So I was at Deloitte Research. I'm not at Accenture Research. We actually run a lot of our own surveys. There's actually a lot hiding in the academic literature in journals that just never makes it out to popular business press. But outside of that, there's a lot of noise right now around the future of work, the future of AI. I think a lot of it's hyperbole. I think if you look at the stats, 90% of business trends last for less than 10 years before they're actually deemed not a great idea, open office space being the most recent. So I think you just have to be really wise and careful in making sure there's so many good think tanks. Brookings Institute was another one, World Economic Forum is another one, really looking at people who are living and breathing this every day and actually bringing research to the conversation, because it's very loud, but there's not a lot of empirical evidence.
Yeah, so I'm sort of the old curmudgeon on my team, so it's really just reading whatever you can get your hands on, and so we have an environment where curiosity and constant learning is part of our culture. So there's never there's not a day that goes by where something's not suggested reading. By the way, we talked earlier about experience management. A great book I'll recommend, The Power of Moments. Really good book that help you think about how to look at experiences. But so that's the type of thing that just circulates through our office all the time. But it's usually fed to me. I don't have to go look for it.
The only other thing I was just going to mention is I also look at a lot of CX, so customer experience, and I actually really like Forrester. They have a lot of good research as well, and even customer experience symposiums, etc. They all cost money, but they have them, and there's a lot of free articles as well on Forrester.
Well, I always start with HackingHR, of course. Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, I learn so much. There's a variety of sources. The only one I do that might be a little unusual, so hopefully it's helpful, is I create a lot of Google alerts on phrases that I find interesting, whether it's future of work or I've got one on AI and coaching. And any company that I think is doing interesting stuff, I'm a big fan of Phenom People, of Jane HR, and some others, I'll have a Google alert on them, so every time they announce something new, I know it the same day.
You can also build up your LinkedIn network, following like different leaders on LinkedIn. I find that's really good too, and commenting to be part of the conversation.
Let's have one last question.
Hi, I'm John. My question really is, you know, in the context of a lot of this conversation, unintentionally, there's a bias that we push forward around certain types of industry and opportunity. But there are a lot of folks involved in human resources that can't really walk back into their organizations because they're agricultural. There's levels of manufacturing, hospitality, casino industries. These folks are not going to be afforded the opportunity to have a lot of this, and so we have a digital divide going on, but we also have a human resources divide where we make those HR professionals feel like they're in a less than desirable arena or industry. My question is, how do we handle that? Because we're exclusive with some of this conversation.
I don't have a good answer, but I'll start and pass it down. We definitely have a digital divide. I don't know about the HR divide. I mean, I think if anything, I see the organizations, including hospitality, healthcare, anybody that has a lot of people, they can use and seem to find the budget and time to explore the innovative solutions. I think if it's agriculture or smaller companies, I see it more as a divide by company size than industry. And I don't know the answer. I mean, I think it goes back to the cost answer. I think there's a lot of tools out there that are fairly affordable, even though they're powered with multi-million-dollar technology. Coach Amanda, if you got $30, IBM Watson can be your coach. $30 a month. It's not an expensive thing. Anybody that can afford, please.
Not to, I don't mean it in terms of cost. I mean, most of the people who work in hospitality aren't even given an email address. So they're not accessing things that aren't, right? So
I see. I thought you meant the HR professionals themselves.
Well, the HR professionals can't use these tools to distribute or to work with their folks because they don't even keep track of their folks.
Yeah. I don't have any experience with companies like that, so I don't know.
So I don't have a whole lot of experience either in this, but what I would say is, you know, to me, you're right, that the housekeeper at the West Inn up the road, you know, is not necessarily going to be included in development skills and things like that as, you know, a sales rep at a pharmaceutical company, right? But I do think that there are opportunities for organizations to inspire their employees, no matter what level or credentials their employees have. I think Southwest Airlines is a nice example of that. You know, we can still say that, you know, a flight attendant still has to go through more training than maybe the housekeeper at the West Inn, but you can still look at it as you know, probably when Southwest, and I don't know if this is really true, but I'm going to assume that when they first started, you know, the whole pass the peanut back thing, I don't even know that those flight attendants had email addresses, you know, at the time, and if they had company cell phones that were paid for, but you know, things are evolving, and I think that when we can I guess, motivate HR professionals to look for opportunities to inspire and motivate employees no matter what level they are in the organization, you will find the happy cook that's going to flip 3 flapjacks for, you know, the employee that's coming to the cafeteria, you know, because they're inspired. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, every situation is just another set of problems to solve for. What we're seeing right now is the mobile technology has now given people who used to not be connected to anything digital an actual pretty powerful device to connect with. SMS text applications are growing pretty rapidly. There's still quite a bit of regulation around you know, text messaging that I think has sort of inhibited its expansion, but we're seeing that pick up quite a lot. I work with a company that uses our technology to recruit people to go to Alaska and process fish off of a boat in the middle of absolute nowhere. and they're using this tech to screen and recruit those individuals. Again, it's all SMS text is the vehicle. So I think technology is getting to the point where some of the people who used to not be connected actually are. One of the big challenges some corporations face is they have huge populations, big percentage of their staff that don't get a company-issued computer, right? So they're not on the network. So how do they connect? So we have had to come up with ways to do single sign-on for employees that do have that connection to the network, and then another means to allow secure connection from those who don't. So that's a common trend that we're seeing across the board. So I think we're getting there. And again, I just look at it as it's always fun to work with an organization that is doing something that you never even knew was being done out there. And so I don't necessarily view it as there's any big gap or divide. It's just another set of problems that we need to try to solve for.
I would probably take this from a little bit of a different angle as a social scientist. I think you're hitting on a very important topic that obviously involves both politics and organizations and individual workers to really come together to help align. The irony in what you've pointed out is those type of professions are actually those that are probably least likely to be automated in the near future. Maybe outside of the burger flipper. But when you start talking about services and hospitality, and so from a mindset as a society, I think we need to do a major shift on what we consider valuable work, especially coming from humans, and treat workers maybe in those classes that I think you're pointing to with dignity, and figure out, you're right, there is a very big divide growing in terms of inequality within our own American workforce, and it's going to take organizations, public policymakers, and individuals to take a look at this and collectively create a psychological shift in our social fabric in the way that we look at work. Much more to go into that.
Okay, so I think it's time to wrap up, but we do have the space, I think, for another half hour. Yeah, so if people wanted to network, hang out, get to know each other, but I just want to thank again our amazing speakers. So yeah. I think everybody learned something today, so thank you for taking your time to come out here.
Evaluations and put down the things you'd like to talk about. Again, for those little rangers in the room, we like to have this community be supportive of you. I think these people in the room kind of want to work, we work in HR, but we also want to work on HR, and that's the purpose of this. So we invite you to join our community involvement. Thank you very much.
Thank you.